Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today, raised bed gardening. I think I've answered this question many times in my career. I've built a couple of them myself, and so we are going to share with you today some of the tips, tricks, maintenance, hacks of raised bed gardening. I hate all those buzzwords I just said. Ugh. Ken is editing this week. He'll know what to do. He'll just leave it in, I guess. So I'm spoiling this all. You know I don't do this by myself every single week because I'm joined every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hi, Ken.
Hello, Chris. Definitely gotta leave that in so we get the algorithms in our favor.
I know. Yep. We're not doing another take. We had to do a retake last week, and you know what? We're just going with it this week. It's you and me. So here we are talking raised beds today. But how are you doing, Ken?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I am doing great. No, tomatoes are ripening now that it is no longer 80 some degrees at night. The humidity let up for a bit, but not that much. It's humid again. It's getting hot again. You getting some ripe love apples in your garden?
We've gotten a few. At our Lukeman garden, we had a bunch. I went out Thursday. They were pretty close. So we got a pretty decent amount of rain on Sunday. And I'm a little afraid to go out and look because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of cracked tomatoes that I'm just going to be tossing into the compost. But yeah, we'll see.
Yes, I have the same feeling. Lots of cracked tomatoes. The fungal disease, which we have not really had issues with these last few years, where the tomatoes just start dying from the bottom up. It's definitely here this year. So lots of tomato, the standard plethora of diseases that they can get. It's definitely happening. So, hey, it's August. It's great.
Yes, eventually. So this is usually about the time where, I don't really care what the garden happens in the garden because I'm kind of over it. But once it cools off, it'll be invigorated again. But
I'm ready for fall.
Yeah, right in the dog days now.
That's true. Yes. So like when it comes to gardening and even landscaping too, I know you have raised beds. I grow in raised beds for certain things. Most of the raised beds I grow in are for work, actually. But so that is the topic of today, Ken, raised bed gardening. We're going to try to go through everything from, why we do it all the way from construction, tips, tricks, materials, what we grow in them, all that. So, but I think we got to kick us off with this week, Ken, of why raise beds? Because it's a lot of work. Why would we go through all this effort to build a raised bed to grow our vegetables?
Yeah, there's several advantages and there's disadvantages too, which we can talk about in a little bit. But with raised beds, you're lifting that garden off the ground in a lot of cases, or higher up off the ground. Really kind of basics. You dry out sooner, warm up sooner in the spring, so you kind of get a jump start. You don't have to wait as long for the soil to dry out. It warms up a little quicker, and that's kind of across the board one reason why people do it. If you've got soil that's contaminated, heavy metals, lead, something like that, you can put these raised beds in. A lot of times they'll put some that geotextile fabric on there, have a barrier in between the contaminated soil and the soil they're bringing in. That allows you to grow in areas where you potentially have contaminated soils. You have poorly drained soils, standing water, stuff like that. Again, raising that soil up off the ground helps it drain. It allows you to grow in areas where you could potentially have poor draining, or probably don't want it in standing water, but areas that drain slowly, or just really other potential soil problems, a lot of compaction. You don't have to deal with breaking that up. You don't have somewhere like soil available to grow in, up in like Chicago, core team meeting we had up there, I don't know how many years ago now. We went to several community gardens. They're growing on asphalt, blacktop, parking lots, stuff like that. So you can put that raised bed there. Again, usually you're putting some kind of lining in between that, but you're filling that, and now you're able to grow plants in areas where you wouldn't otherwise be able to because of that impervious surface there. physical mobility issues, if you have issues with bending, things like that, again, you're raising the soil up off the ground can help reduce that. And really, you can build raised beds pretty much as tall as you want. There's going to be some limitations there. It can be very expensive to do that, but you can raise them up off the ground. It could be 4 inches, it could be 3 feet. Again, you got to fill that, but you can raise that up so you're not having to bend. Um, or if wheelchair access, make it easier for people in a wheelchair to access that stuff. So there's quite a few different advantages to kind of raising that stuff off the ground.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think especially the mobility issues. One of our vegetable gardening classes, when you're talking about raised beds, we're talking about also container gardens. The topic of salad tables comes up. I think that's what they call these sort of raised platforms that you can kind of wheel underneath, and it's like a table, and it's rectangular shaped, and you can grow vegetables in it. But I still think we sort of came to the consensus on that. It's more of a container system for the salad table. Usually with our raised beds, we are connected to the ground in some way. That we might have that geotext fabric underneath there, to make sure that we're not getting any contaminants or nothing leaching upwards from the soil, or pavement beneath. But yeah, it's raised beds. We're really looking specifically like it is resting on the ground essentially.
Yeah, and like a keyhole garden would be
Hmm.
something you could, it's try to see if I can find a picture. It's kind of kidney shaped. So basically, you got an area in the middle where you could walk into, or if you make it low enough, you could get a wheelchair or something into that, and it's going to be you can reach that while you're kind of in the middle of the bed.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's been a huge benefit. There is a cost associated with those taller beds, but I know we've done, at our Knox County nursing home project site for Master Gardeners, we've built fairly taller raised beds, and just the kind of mental, sort of just awakening that occurs when someone who's been out inside for a while with poor mobility issues and can get outside and get their hands dirty, get them like all enmeshed in lettuce greens and all kinds of other plants. Yeah, it's really an awakening of their senses and memories. So they can be incredibly beneficial from that mental health standpoint as well.
Yeah, but I will say it's there are some drawbacks to doing raised beds, and kind of mentioned
Hmm.
there's the cost associated with constructing these if you're going to be doing a one that you're constructing. So the materials to build it, the soil to fill it, is you're going to incur some cost there. Because they do drain, quicker.
Hmm.
It can be an advantage, but can also be a disadvantage. A lot of times you're watering these a little more frequently than you would in in-ground bed, just because they're draining much quicker, especially if you're not getting a lot of rain or it's really hot. Not as bad as like a pot, but they don't have that kind of necessarily that big reserve of water to pull from like you do in the ground. So there are going to be some drawbacks, like everything in life. There's benefits and drawbacks to everything.
That's true. That's true. Well, diving along more into this raised bed journey here, there's a lot of ways to build something to make it taller than the surroundings. Lots of materials can be used to build a raised bed, and I did see in a lot of the research, the defense for having structural raised beds or confined raised beds. There's a couple different terms, but essentially building something to hold that soil. As raised beds is a common practice in commercial vegetable production and even landscape plant production as well, where you have a machine that goes through and mounds the soil up, but there's no physical like wall holding that soil in place. And a lot of those studies show that there's quite a bit of leaching and erosion that do occur in those systems. And then you have to have a machine come back and reshape the beds probably every year, maybe even new each time you rotate in and out of crop. So, requires special mechanical equipment. It eventually settles, you get leaching, erosion, all of that. So, we're talking specifically about constructed raised beds. We have frames around them, and these frames can be made out of what I like to use, just wood. I like using plain old pine wood that will rot within 5 years because I don't care. I'll just rip up that rotten board and replace it. But there's not always something what people can do. Maybe you want something that will last a little bit longer. Maybe you would want something that looks better. And so there, if we start down this list of materials, the things that we can have are first is just the wood. You can choose between treated lumber or untreated lumber. And when you're selecting that treated lumber, just making sure that you're avoiding any of those reused railroad ties, anything that would have been used in an industrial sense, and railroads is an industrial use of lumber. And so, we don't want to be using that because the chemicals used in those wood preservatives are not labeled for use in a residential landscape. So I know that there are some people who are very proud of maybe you live in a railroad town, you like the idea of having railroad ties in your yard as part of your landscape. If it is from an actual railroad situation, it is technically illegal to be using that because they are not labeled for use for residences. They are only labeled for industrial use only. Normal treated lumber, though, I guess we should talk about this. In the past, it was CCA, chromated copper arsenate, and that arsenate might trigger a warning in people's heads, arsenic. Some of these chemicals we do not want leaching out. We also have copper in there, but copper is more toxic to plants than it really is us. And it has to be a pretty concentrated or a pretty localized dose of that copper element to affect that plant. And so, but that CCA product that has been phased out for purchase by homeowners. So you might still be able to find that, but again, it's only for those industrial or those commercial applications. It is not something that you can find available at the lumber store in your neighborhood. So what it has been replaced with is ACQ, or alkaline copper quaternary. So it still has that copper in there. I know some people are still a little concerned about copper in treated lumber products, but again, it is it is more toxic to plants than us. So it is something, if your plants start declining because of copper toxicity, then you could start worrying about that. But the leaching of those elements don't necessarily spread throughout the bed. It's very localized right next to the soil against those wood products. But I use untreated. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
I was say for that, there was Oregon State. Some people did a little study on that, and we can put a link to the write up they did, and it only moves, like an inch or two from that board into the soil. Like when they tested in the middle of the bed, there was no excess copper, and even the excess they found wasn't very high. So you're more than likely, I'm not going to say never, get myself in trouble, but more than likely you're not going to have any issues with copper toxicity coming from your boards.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I use untreated wood for my raised beds. You could do cedar, which is kind of as a naturally rot resistant, but I live in a rural area. They don't even carry cedar boards in our local hardware store. So it is a special order and they're expensive. So it again is usually a 2x6 pine board that I'm using untreated. So do you use raised bed wood material for your raised beds, Ken?
Yes, we've got some wood raised beds, and we used pressure treated, and we've had those for some of them about 8 years now, and we don't have no issues with the wood anyway. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, I'd say we use untreated pine. We installed our raised beds in 2017, 2017. And probably in 2022, that's when we started swapping things out. I was like, oh yeah, this board's pretty rotted. Pull that out. We swapped that out. The only thing left behind in some corners was like the wood screw. That everything else totally rotted away. But we just slapped back on a few more pine boards. So yeah, I can find some pictures of that. We did order some cedar boards for some of these raised beds. And, they're not rotting as quickly, but they are still decomposing. You can tell they're much, if I kicked it really hard, my foot might go through it or something. But, um, and there's a lot of warping that seems to have occurred with those cedar boards. So, yeah, so I would say wood, treated, untreated, might be one of the most popular materials for building your raised beds. But I have used logs also, just fallen trees out of the woods, pulled those out. And this was for a raised bed area at my parents' house. And we shaped a nice little woodland garden bed and we filled that with some fill dirt. And so we have used something like just fallen trees for raised beds. And that's something where as they rot, it actually adds to the character of the garden. And so it was all done on purpose with the hope that they would rot. And if we ever found any more trees, well, we just drag them over and um, then rebuild the border with fallen trees. So, um, yeah, so I would say wood, most popular out there.
Yeah, and probably the easiest to
Hmm.
find out and probably the cheapest. Maybe not in the long run if you're replacing constantly, but if you just want to get started, probably the easiest and cheapest way to go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there is a hybrid of sorts. There is composite lumber, which that is something I think there's different products out there. Some might be like sort of a mixture or a slurry of plastic and wood pulp kind of fibers, which they then extrude into these. They look like boards or board-like products that you can cut just like a regular piece of wood. Um, and so you could do some type of a composite like that, and probably I'm sure out there there's just straight plastic raised beds that you could get. I don't know if I would go straight plastic. It just sort of depends on that material. But yeah, there's also that composite lumber.
Yeah, and that's going to be, at least whenever I've seen composite lumber, like deck boards and stuff like that, it is significantly more expensive
Hmm.
than your wood. So keep that in mind when you're pricing things out, as you're going to
Yeah,
be spending a lot more money on that composite.
that's true. And I don't know if we dare delve into microplastics, Ken.
Yeah, I don't know if there's been any research done on how much microplastics something like composite lumber would shed.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, not to be flippant of it, but it's everywhere. So
It sure is. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I guess personal decision. I try to avoid as much plastic as possible use in my landscape, but you'll see I'm a total hypocrite when we get to drip irrigation. But yes, the next material though is metal. I see a lot of these for sale these days, Ken. Just these online kits, these metal corrugated looking um, raised beds. They like kind of look like those old makeshift water troughs, and people are using them, setting them out. Actually, there was a recent a video done with University of Nebraska. Their wildlife person commented that these metal raised beds it's actually a really good deterrent for voles with a V, that they are not able to climb up these metal sides to get into your vegetable garden. Now, I don't know if that means could they burrow under and go up? Maybe, or maybe if you buried the sides a little bit, that would prevent that. So, but metal has been very popular. I know you have some metal raised beds at Lukeman Gardens.
yeah, so yeah, we started with some wood beds. They did only lasted 2 years before they started falling apart. So we
Mhm.
converted to the metal raised beds, and yeah, they're the ones we've got. It's just panels that you screw together. So they with a nut, a bolt, and some washers. So you can kind of, to an extent, depending on what kit you get, customize how long it is, how narrow it is. It's usually what do we have? It's 2.5 feet or like 4 feet wide. So again, depending on how you configure it, um, yeah, you can figure it multiple ways. You can buy multiple kits and make a 30-foot long bed with those if you wanted. I will say, and I can throw some pictures in here. We do have some taller ones, and they were a little bit shorter, so they didn't come with any brace rods to go across, and we're starting to get some bulging. Some of those, especially when ones that were didn't get the ground perfectly flat. It's a little bit of an angle. We're getting some of the sides starting to bulge out. So we've gone to the kits that are a little bit bigger, a little more expensive. You can make longer beds, but they come with brace rods to help kind of prevent some of that bowing. So keep that in mind. And there's numerous companies out there that'll sell them. They come in all kinds of different colors. Kind of a white, green, brown, tan. I'm sure there's probably more out there, but those are the ones that kind of the most common colors that you see there. And then various heights, you know, 8 inches, 24 inches, 32 inches. So there's a lot of different options out there when it goes to metal, a lot more than there used to be anyway.
Mhm. And then the other material, probably maybe one of the most permanent out there, is using something like stone or rock. And whether that is like a dry laid stone, or maybe you use some type of mortar to hold it in place. That's definitely an option, especially for folks who live in rockier parts of the world. Looking at people over at the Flint Hills of Kansas, where I used to live, where you dig a hole and you hit a rock. So it's really hard to have basements out there without digging a bunch of rock out. So if you have access to a lot of just stone naturally around, or if you go buy it, or wherever you might find it, I would say there are, I think, some rules in some states where they don't want you pulling stones out of natural areas. So just make sure that you're adhering to all local rules and laws about where you harvest your rock or your stones. But then also we have brick and concrete construction supplies that you can use to build your raised beds.
Yeah, I think that's another I would say it's probably a little more popular with like ornamental type beds. I don't know, that just seems more permanent than you would have like for a vegetable garden.
Mhm.
But yeah, let's cinder blocks, see those quite a bit, or even brick raised beds as a house is being built. Those are built with it like around a patio or something like that. But
Yeah.
again, I would say fairly cheap, depending on what brick or concrete block you're choosing. But yeah, it's pretty affordable still.
Mhm. Well, Ken, in our boundless pursuit of growing plants, we have built many raised beds, or put them together. Whether or not you read the directions, I don't know. I try to as often as I can. So, do we have any tips, or should we walk people through like putting one together, or like what are some of our construction tips for folks?
Yeah, I think the big one is kind of the corner bracing. And if you're building a longer bed, make sure you've got bracing that's usually 4 to 6 feet, so you don't get that bowing. So it's another
Hmm.
tower, whether it's in the tie rods for your metal raised bed, what have you. But usually for your wooden raised beds, if you're doing it, it's a real simple one: 2x4s, 2x6, one by whatever. You've got your long your longer boards. You're making sure you're screwing those into like a corner piece. A lot of times people use a 2x4 or 4x4 in the corners. Screw into that. There's brackets that you can buy for that purpose. But really kind of anchoring those corners well. For the raised beds that we have, the wooden ones, we got concrete blocks that have notches in them that you can slide a 2x6 into. And there's a hole in the middle that you can drive rebar through. So that's how we built ours. So no screws or anything like that in there. And then when we built it, we built some and we made them. We forgot to account for the blocks when we built them, so we made them 4 feet wide. But then the blocks add another 4 or 5 inches on each, so it's more like 4.5, almost 5 foot to the middle. So it makes it a little difficult to reach the middle. So when you're building these, typically you don't recommend any wider than 4 feet if you can reach from all sides. If you can only reach from one side, looking at more 2 feet, that's about how far somebody can reach. If you make it wider, then you got to start walking in it, which kind of defeats the purpose in a lot of cases of building a raised bed. So checking your dimensions and just making it sturdy enough so that your boards aren't bowing out. I think would be the big things.
Hmm. No, I think that is the making sure you don't step in there is a very important uh, tip for us, because if you build especially a tall raised bed, it's really hard to get a tiller up there to relieve that compaction that your feet cause. So, yeah, the whole idea of that raised bed is that we don't have to walk in it, we don't have to compact that soil, um, and it becomes hopefully a better medium for plant growth with the root system. But we'll talk more about that, I think, in the fill part here just coming up. But um, maybe a few other things like definitely making sure we fought Boeing a lot with our some of our raised beds. We did take some pieces of 2x4, cut like an arrowhead shape on the bottom of them, screwed that to the side of the wall of the raised bed, hammered that in the ground, and that lasted for a little bit, but of course it rotted, and then Boeing, kept happening. So we now use those foot long landscape spikes, like they look like giant nails. We drill a hole through there, through the board, and we put that into the ground. You could also use rebar. You could put pipe straps on the inside, and that rebar could just slide right through that pipe strap and hold that wall in place. The other thing that some of your like pipe straps and other fixtures you could do is that you could design your raised bed to then have like a PVC or metal conduit, then slide onto that rebar or into that pipe strap. And then you could put plastic over top. Boom, you have an instant low tunnel, instant season extension. Also, we're going to get into the drip irrigation side of things, but as you're putting these beds together, think about how you're going to be getting water to them. If you're going to be using drip irrigation, where is that plastic pipe going to come up? Is it going to come up the side of the bed? Are you going to install it on in the inside of the bed? Just things like that to consider when building those raised beds, and a few fancy extra add-ons. Um, and I guess the other thing is it's important to know when you are um, using lumber or wood, screwing into the end grain of lumber is not a very strong connection. And so that's why those corner blocks are so important, as Ken mentioned. Um, but it will help in the very short term, keeping those boards together. But you really need that corner blocking because a screw at the end of the wood just will pull right out over time.
Yeah, or look for there's a lot of garden catalogs that will sell just like the corner bracing kits
Hmm.
and stuff too. They're usually metal or something like that if you want maybe something
Yeah.
a little more aesthetic than a 4x4 cut off in the ground.
Right. Yes. And I'm sure everyone, listening, watching, you probably built raised beds yourself. So if you have any tips or things that you've learned over the years, please feel free. Leave those comments down below. Yeah.
So we teased fill material. And
Mhm.
this is one thing, at least here that in Jacksonville, that I've always kind of struggled with is finding good fill material. So I know
Yes.
when we first built our raised beds, we got a load of topsoil, doing that in air quotes, because when it got delivered, it was more like fill. There was
Mhm.
rocks and bricks and glass and slag in there, and we were doing this for vegetable gardens, like not growing vegetables and that. So we dug it all out, used it to patch holes in the yard. Took a while to get some grass and stuff growing in there, so I'm glad we weren't growing vegetables. But you can find bag stuff at the box stores. And a lot of that's really high in organic matter, a lot of peat,
Mhm.
forest byproduct, I think is what they call it, mulch. So that you're going to get a lot of settling with a lot of that stuff. So I think a lot of times, depending on where you live, is going to dictate a little bit um, what you're going to be using for fill material and the quality of that.
That is true. Yeah. And especially like if you can use the soil where you're growing, the native soil, that might be more of like an ideal situation. But you might be building a raised bed because it's contaminated or because there's some other issues, compaction, pH, whatnot. So, um, but in some research that I was reading through, one of this it was like a master's thesis. I think it was from Georgia, where this student looked at every raised beds and the fill composition, and they grew kale and basil. and three different crops, So three iterations of that. Um, I'll probably get some of these incorrect here, so maybe I should pull this up to actually read it. But she did look at compost only, native soil only, pine bark only, wood fiber mulch only, so basically wood chips, um, and then 50-50 combinations of each. Uh, and so it was what this person had found. And remember, this is one study, one season, one person doing this. But what they found was that the compost overall performed better than any of the others. However, once they got to the third cropping event of the season, so they've done their first one, composted good, second one, composted good. We're late in the season. The native soil was just as good as the compost. So they were statistically identical for that third round for that season. So really what the conclusion of the study was is that maybe an ideal fill for this would be something 50-50 compost native soil mix. Um, and also with the big caveat that, hey, we need to keep researching this because a lot more people are wanting to do raised bed gardening in their yards. Um, and I'd say, Ken, you mentioned settling. It's such a pain in the neck, isn't it? Raised beds, they always settle. Um, it's because a lot of them are mostly organic matter, and organic matter is not permanent. It goes away, it gets used, goes up in the atmosphere. We lose it. Soil, native soil, one component of that native soil is minerals. Minerals do not go away unless through wind or water erosion or a shovel. But if none of those forces act on it, it stays there. And so that is one of the things that can help limit or at least reduce some of that settling is to have actual mineral soil in there, that sand, silt, and clay. Um, Now, when we go in and we buy mineral soil, native soil, we do have structure, but a lot of that structure has been lost in that process of digging it up, putting it in your raised bed, mixing it with compost. So we've lost a lot of that structure. It can be rebuilt over time, but you're going to keep getting that settling. You're going to keep getting that, so you have to keep adding to it. So for our raised beds, we did a 50-50 mixture, and that first 2 years actually, we did to cover crops underneath our plants. So we had tomatoes growing up, and then underneath our tomato plants, we had cover crops. And I feel like that helped to stabilize and create a little bit of structure in the short term. Um, and no, there's no research that I'm quoting on this one at all. So it's just something we did. Like, well, we got to do something so that it doesn't drain so quickly and that we don't settle so quickly. So cover crops seem to do a little bit of help. We did do again anecdotal just study in that we had raised beds in our high tunnel. One was filled with potting soil, basically a peat-based mix. One had compost, and another was just the native soil. We did cover crops on them. Throw a picture up here of that cover cropped raised bed. And we then planted sweet potatoes that next year. And it really seemed like the sweet potatoes in the native soil seemed to perform much better. Compost did pretty well too. The potting soil did not do well at all. It was just too sharply drained. It just dried out too quickly.
Yeah, I think if you live in a probably a little more populated area, a lot of times if you're getting that raised bed mix, a lot of times it's some kind of organic matter, maybe some topsoil with sand mixed
Mhm.
in to kind of help with that drainage because you lose a lot of that structure. So there's again, depending on where you live, there's probably kind of special raised bed mix that you can get from nurseries or garden centers, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
if you're in a more rural area, at least in my experience, you're a little more limited as to what you can find.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is one of those downfalls with raised beds is you are now starting off with no soil structure. Um, the soil has these pores in it, Ideally, a good soil has 50% pore space. Um, 25% of that is water. The other 25 is air. And the rest is mineral and organic matter content. So that's the whole soil pie for the ideal loam soil. Um, but the soil pore sizes, they vary in a good soil structure. There's teeny tiny ones and there's big ones and everything in between. And because you have different pore sizes, you are able to hold more water in those smaller pores. It doesn't drain through gravity as quickly, or the roots can't extract it as easily. And so you just have you have better water holding capacity, and it just doesn't drain as fast, and that just doesn't exist in raised bed soil right off the bat. It I would imagine, Ken, it takes years and years to build some type of structure like that in a raised bed.
Yeah, and especially as talking vegetable gardens, we're only have stuff in there for a couple months out of the year, and we're removing it. Um, Ornamental bed, when you constantly have roots in the ground, you may be building that structure up a little bit faster. If you're putting cover crops, which I've started putting cover crops in our raised beds, just basically taking a year off, let the rye grow up and die, and just kind of leave it, let it break down, and kind of hopes of building some of that structure on ours. But the more you can have roots in there, the better, because they're releasing those chemicals that make the
Mhm.
stick the soil particles together and stuff. You kind of hopefully speed up that process of that structure forming a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah. Oh, one question I always get from folks, they've built a really tall raised bed. They want to know, can I put like plastic jugs or gravel or something cheaper in the bottom half of this raised bed? So, do you ever get that question, Ken?
I don't know if I have. What do you tell people?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Um, what I tell folks is that this is a case by case basis. Understandably, not everyone's budget. You definitely want to garden, you want to grow your own food. Um, the one situation I'm thinking of, they wanted to grow native perennials in these raised beds. So you got to go case by case basis. If you really can't, if you do not have the budget to fill your raised bed with all soil, but you're like, yeah, I really want to grow. I'm like, well, I mean, fill what you can and then plant. But if you need to add, a little bit of material on the bottom, I guess go for it. From a plant or maybe a plant health standpoint, that's not necessarily a good recommendation. Because what we want to give these plants is as much soil volume as possible. Um, and so I tell the folks, look, I understand your budget you might not be able to do this, but this, from the horticultural, like plant health standpoint, we want to give them as much root space as possible. And so maybe I've, you know, kind of said, yeah, sure. I guess throw a couple empty milk jugs in there. It's going to hurt. But um, again, with saying like, but the ideal thing to do is not do that. Um, and so I would say, give them as much root space as possible, especially those native perennial plants that they want to grow. I mean, they got deep root systems. They need room to grow. So yeah.
Say raised beds dry out quick enough as it is. The less soil
Hmm.
you have in there, the more quickly that's going to dry out. So keep that in
Precisely.
mind too.
Yeah. Oh, and we talked about geotextile fabric for contaminated soil conditions, but I mean, if you don't have that site constraint, is it necessary to lay cardboard on the bottom or kill the grass, or do you need to do
Um,
anything?
I'll say for my raised beds, we just build them and fill them. I don't kill the
Hmm.
grass beforehand because that grass probably is not going to grow through, in our case, 10 inches of soil. And if it does, well, I'm kind of the animal you probably deserve to live if you if you push all
Give it
the
a
way through that.
trophy.
But
Yeah.
and it's it's going to be pretty easy to pull if it managed to grow all the way through that. And it's probably
Hmm.
not doing all that well. So yeah, I don't bother killing stuff off before. I mean, you can, but if
Yeah.
maybe if you've got like you're only doing a 2-3 inch raised bed, you may benefit
Hmm.
a little bit from killing it off first. But if you've got a deep enough, personally, I don't see know if seeing the point is the right way to put it, but I don't think it's
Yeah.
worthwhile to smother everything and then fill it.
Right. Yep, I agree. I'd say maybe the only thing you would do if it is a really shallow one, scalp the lawn if you're growing on a lawn. Just take your mower, drop it to the lowest setting, and only in that footprint of that raised bed, just scalp it down. Um, that's the only thing I could think of in a really shallow raised bed. Anything more than I'd say 3, 4 inches should get killed by what you're putting on top of it.
Yeah, and with that cardboard, depending on what's coated with it, may just shed water, which
Yeah,
may cause you some
we,
problems too.
we don't want that. Yeah.
And it's not going to break down right away either, more than likely.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Well, I guess, have we accidentally gone into maintenance because our next topic here was maintenance. Um, but I don't know. So we do the cover crops. Um, in terms of replacing fill, we we do use wood mulch to mulch our garden, and that just sort of breaks down over time, and we just sort of keep adding to it. So, um, if I had, we used up all of our native soil that we had, so we don't really have any of that to add more to it unless we go buy some more. And so that, it's really just we refill our raised beds with mulch and that decomposes and it just sort of just keeps building up that organic layer on top. Do you do anything to fill them up?
Yeah, and a couple of ours, the ones we've had for 7 or 8 years now, they've settled quite a bit. So we've actually gotten some bagged raised bed mix, put it in there, and I just use like a garden fork to turn it over a little bit to mix it up. But I'm not tilling and really beating up that soil, just kind of incorporating it a little bit. I don't know if I should admit to this, but sometimes pots, when we're done with soil in the pots, we'll just dump them in there. It may
Mhm.
not be the best thing to do, but um, that's what we do. Well, that's what we do. So do it at your own risk, because there's a potential if you've got pathogens or something in there, you're introducing that into your raised beds. But if it's questionable, we don't. But a lot of times we'll just plant died for whatever reason, didn't water it enough. That pot will get dumped into the raised beds
Mhm.
and stuff. So, yeah, we do have to probably next spring. We'll probably be buying quite a bit of raised bed mix. So some of them have the 2x6 boards. Some of them settled down below that 2x6 board. So it's time to do some major replenishing.
Well, we also had mentioned this multiple times about how these raised beds are very quickly draining. They dry out very, very fast. Um, at least here in for our gardens in Macomb, we have gone to drip irrigation, and I don't know if we could do it without drip irrigation. Um, Otherwise, we would need to have someone out there almost daily watering. What do we have? Over 20 raised beds out here. Because we are growing for our food donation garden here, we are growing on an old gravel driveway. It was the only place that we were able to get approval to put our garden on our site. And we put the shovel in the ground and it didn't go very far. So that's why we decided to go the raised bed route. And um, but they do dry out so fast that if we did not have drip irrigation, um, I would lose volunteers immediately because it can be hot and it is not fun watering this big garden when it's so hot, but it's all automated. We have it on a timer. It kicks on twice a week when it's hot and dry, and it irrigates for about an hour. Actually, I have it set to an hour and 5 minutes. Um, you can calculate that based upon the flow rate of the drip line that you select. How many gallons per minute does it let out? And just sort of over the years, I've just figured that an hour is a good amount of time. You go out with your hands or you could use a screwdriver, trowel, or something, and you probe around after you've run that drip irrigation system just to see how deep it's gone. And, is it penetrating down from the top of that raised bed down to the bottom? That's really what we want to see. We don't want to have any excess water draining out of the bottom necessarily, but um, that is the time that works best for our soil mix as it is now, and the size of our garden and the flow rate of our drip irrigation system.
Yeah, I'll say the stuff we have at home, we hand water. Um, should get drip irrigation set up. And at Lukeman, it's the same thing. We hand water. That I usually go out in the mornings, spend half hour or so watering if it needs it. And a lot of times later in there, because a lot of the raised beds we have aren't very tall. So as plants get bigger, they can get down into that native
Mhm.
soil. And it's not this time of year, it's not quite as bad as early in the spring, early in the summer. If we get dry, they'll need a little bit more. I'll say was it last week I was started watering, and immediately the water started coming out the bottom. That soil, because most of it's bagged, like
Mhm.
potting mix or the raised bed mix, which is kind of glorified potting mix. So it dried out pretty quick, and it just kind of ran through. So
Yeah, needs to rehydrate so that it doesn't shed water; it absorbs water.
yeah, but yeah, the plants didn't look, considering how quickly that drained through there, they didn't look bad. So I'm assuming a lot of those are probably down into the native soil now and able to pull some water from there.
Mhm. Yeah. And I would say drip irrigation is not difficult. Most companies anymore, you pick out whatever brand you want. You can go online and they have videos that show you how to install them, how to set them up, how to maintain them, and how to prep them for winter. Um, Biggest tip on drip irrigation when it comes to winterization: any hard plastic fittings, it works best to get them out of the garden. A lot of that flexible plastic might be okay, especially if you blow out your lines, or you drain them properly so that there's no water sitting in there when it freezes. But even that hard plastic, I've just, you go out in the spring, you put everything together, do your first test, and there's these geysers that pop up randomly in the garden where you have these T's and elbows and stuff like, oh, I was just lazy last year. I didn't take off those hard fittings and they split. Um, so yeah, and they are plastic. For the most part, it's all plastic materials. And I said I try not to use as plastic in the garden, but that's one of the things, or that is the exception to my rule, because again, we could do it without it.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd say drip irrigation, doing it by hand. Just if it gets dry, we typically are aiming for an inch of water a week. If you're not getting it through rain, plan on watering your raised beds or keep an eye on them. Go out and look at the soil, stick your finger in there and see if it needs it.
Yep. And this summer, our irrigation system has been off most of the time. We have not had to water, but maybe a handful of times earlier in the year. Well, I guess, what are we watering in these raised beds, Ken? What can we grow in a raised bed? Is this just like an in-ground garden?
Yeah, I'd say again, it's depending on the size of your raised bed and really kind of the plant. I'd say just about anything you can grow in the ground, you could potentially grow in a raised bed. Now, on the vegetable side, for me, carrots, potatoes. I've really got where I only grow those in raised beds because we have fairly heavy soils, and it's just easier to grow those in raised beds. It's easier to dig them. Half the time you don't have to dig them; you can just pull the carrots straight out and stuff. Don't get really disfigured carrots unless I don't thin them out. That's really the only time I get weird looking carrots now. Because that is a looser soil. Same thing with potatoes. It's a lot easier to dig those than in the soil that's got a lot of clay in it. A lot easier to clean them too. Well, that way too. So for our root crops and stuff, I think raised beds are really good, especially for most of Illinois where we have, or a lot of Illinois where we have heavier soils. Um, one that's commonly you kind of shy away from growing in raised beds on the vegetable side, be like sweet corn, just because we need blocks of that. Now there are some shorter types, those are the on deck type that only gets what 2 feet tall or something like that. So, if you can, you got big enough raised beds where you can put that in blocks, that could be a potential. Some of the larger vining plants, pumpkins and stuff, you could plant them in the raised bed, but the more likely they're going to spill out of that into the rest of the landscape, which is fine. But if you don't want that, then you're looking at trellising them or something. But they're going to more than likely take over that raised bed unless you're growing some of the some of the melons. You have more dwarf sizes that you could put in there. But yeah, in our garden, vegetable wise, um, root crops, a lot of herbs, stuff like that is what we grow in there.
Yeah, we also treat it pretty much like a typical garden that we have a lot of tomatoes, peppers, do cucumbers. We also have a lot of trellises where we are, along with groundhogs. So the fencing to keep the groundhog out is also does double duty as trellising for some of our cucumbers. We do pole beans instead of bush beans. Um, and because with that trellising system that we've built for our raised beds, bush beans would take up more space than probably the amount of beans that we could harvest in that narrower bed. So instead of growing more horizontally, we're growing more vertically with a lot of our crops. And so yeah, we use fencing quite a bit in our garden to grow taller as opposed to growing outward and sprawling. So yeah, no pumpkins for us. We do cucumbers sometimes on the ground. We have one raised bed with just sprawling cucumbers in it, and um, it's growing cucumbers, but the ones growing on the fencing are still nicer. I- yeah, so yeah, a lot of the vining stuff we have to trellis it upwards.
Now, you mentioned the raised beds keeping voles out. They don't do
Mhm.
anything for groundhogs.
They do
They've
not.
how it look when they've eaten all my peanuts and carrots.
His darn groundhog. Actually, in our garden shed at the here at the extension office, it has burrowed underneath and it has chewed a hole through the floor of the garden shed, and it has now decided it likes living in the shed as opposed to under the shed much better. So, wildlife. Well, Ken, we do focus a lot on vegetable growing with our raised beds. But I mentioned before native perennials. You don't have to just do vegetables in our raised beds, especially if this is for someone who maybe can't stoop or bend down as well, and so they want to grow up a little bit higher. Works really nicely around like patio settings. Growing ornamentals, flowers in raised beds. Dare I say certain perennials, maybe even woody perennials like shrubs. Is that possible?
Yeah, it is gonna be possible. Yeah, I think the kind of the one issue I can think of with growing more perennial stuff in raised beds is that soil settling. Um, so you're just gonna have a hard time adding more to that. You may just kind of have to live with the settling to
Mhm.
some extent because you don't want to bury those perennials. But yeah, you could certainly do that. And even we're talking about ornamentals, but like something like a blueberry, where we need those really amended soils, acidic soils, which we don't really usually have in Illinois, that would be a good option. If you don't want to grow in a container, build a raised bed for your blueberries or those perennials that need a little more modified soils or soils that we can't provide in a lot of Illinois.
Yeah. And maybe in those situations, I would suggest to folks look more at using a native soil uh, fill, instead of a 50-50 compost native soil, maybe push that, more 60% native soil, maybe 75% native soil. It's going to be heavier. It's going to be more expensive. There's going to be a lot more shrink swell also with native soils because if you have a native soil, at least here where we're at, you have clay. Clay, there's a lot of shrink swell when it comes to when it's from dry to wet. Um, so you might have to have beefier walls, maybe thicker lumber, maybe like a 4x4 or 6x4, basically larger post-like lumber for those just more structural plants like a blueberry, because they make these patio blueberries, which you can grow. They're cute. They have good fall colored, pretty white flowers in the spring, and fruit, blueberries. So, and there's other shrubs and things that we could, talk about with these. I'm thinking of aronias, those low scape mounds that they also have these days. Some of our viburnums that are, can be planted around there. So, in essence, what we're saying, you might have to have sturdier raised beds if you're looking to do like perennial or even woody shrubs in these beds.
And up the regular soil content.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. Well, that was a lot of great information about growing in raised beds, building raised beds, what materials we use to put them all together. Well, the Good Growing Podcast, production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson. Hey, Ken, thanks for hanging out with me today, talking about raised beds and editing for 2 weeks in a row. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. One of these days I keep saying this, I'll get my drip irrigation set up for my raised beds.
Just give me a call.
I keep saying it, I'll speak it into existence one of these days.
Mm-hmm.
Let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. Well, one of the components of a fill for raised beds is compost. So let's talk about compost next week. How do we make it? We will be diving into the old compost bin and see what's going on in there. Well, listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening, or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.